Hi, this is JD Wisgo, author of Self-Taught Japanese and literary translator and publisher. In this video, I'm going to be showing a new project that I'm starting called TransLiterary Lab. This will be the first one. So, what is TransLiterary Lab? Well, in this project, I'm going to be taking a short fiction passage, of course in Japanese, and I'll be performing Japanese English translation on it in real time. This will include research about the meaning of any of the words of the passage, and also research about how to do the right translation. I will not be doing any pre-research for this. I may look at the passage briefly, but I'm not going to be actually doing research before I start the video, nor am I going to be doing any translation. So it'll be, for the most part, live, and I'll be focusing on the process that I'm using, and I'll be targeting beginning translators or anyone who's interested in getting into translation or just wants to see how it works. Keep in mind, I'm not going to end up with necessarily a professional final result. I'll probably try to iterate over it and get it pretty good. But if I was doing it for a book or something, I would spend a bit more time and do some extra research and potentially get even people to look it over to kind of just do a double check in certain cases, or ask people for meaning in cases where I really can't figure out what it means. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so as for the passage, since we're kind of starting out, I wanted to keep it pretty simple. And let's see. So you may be familiar with Akutagawa Ryunosuke. Okay, pretty famous author. A lot of his stuff is translated, so what we end up with may already be translated. If it is, that's okay. The intention here isn't to publish it or anything. It's just to kind of go through the process. So you may be familiar with Aozora Bunko, which is where there's basically a large online library of free texts for things which have been how should I say, the copyright is expired, although in certain cases the copyright may not be expired, so you gotta double check if you want to publish it. So we'll just kind of start there. Go to the index page of our author here. So I'll just kind of pick this one that I just briefly looked at earlier, called Kaeru, which is frog, for those of you who don't know, and this is the kanji for Kaeru. And then if we scroll down, we can see the text itself. Sometimes there's multiple formats. And while you're here, if this is the first time you're seeing this really great site, of course there's a lot of stuff in Japanese here, but you can also see this is basically the author's date of birth and when he died. And then this is the first publishing, which sometimes is irrelevant. But the actual year that the story was written may not be listed. You just kind of have to guess. Obviously, it was written before he died, and it was not written at the time of the publishing because that was much later. Anyway, so we'll get started. Okay, so and like I said, I briefly glanced at this, but I didn't even read the first two paragraphs. I just briefly looked at it to get a feel for the difficulty. So I would say, just in terms of difficulty, this is relatively easy. I mean, compared to all the stuff that's on this website, Aozora Bunko. Keep in mind, a lot of the texts are 100 years old, 80 years old. They're pretty old, and you can get some really difficult Japanese. So this is a little bit on the easier side. However, before we get started, I just want to mention that this is using, because it is somewhat old, it does use some old traditions, some old Japanese that you won't see in modern Japanese. Now, I have actually written an article or two about some of that, which maybe I'll give a link to in the YouTube description. But I'll mention those as I come across them, and then when you go through Aozora Bunko yourself, it'll be a little easier for you to kind of get started. So we'll kind of go line by line here. And I'm going to read these. Keep in mind, I'm not a professional, narrator, so my pronunciation may not be completely perfect, but it should be good enough just for these purposes. Okay. 自分の今寝込んでいる脇に古い池があって、そこにカエルがたくさんいる. Okay, so this is basically a pretty straightforward sentence grammatically. So what I'm going to do is switch over to here. But the trick is, as I mentioned, there's some older traditional Japanese being used here. So I want to talk about that first. We notice when I cut and paste the furigana, the kanji reading hints, kind of get hard to read here because they're not separated. So I'll just kind of add parentheses. Okay, so basically there's a few things. There's, first of all, these characters, which are a little weird. This is an older style character, which you can just think of for all purposes as is mean I from a I, U, E, O, like the second letter of the alphabet. And then sometimes in some words you'll see where a he means an e. So this here, kaheru, is actually kaeru. Excuse me, which is of course from the name of the work. And then in terms of the rest of this, the one at the end is also this other character, an older character. So this would get translated to, and when I say translated, I mean in Japanese, into modern Japanese, not English, of course, in terms of iru, right, which is like the verb of existence for living things. And then in terms of that, okay, so I think we have a good understanding of the classical elements there in terms of just reading it. So the next question is, what about the words and the grammar? So for now, I'm going to assume that you may be pretty basic Japanese, you may be advanced. So I'm just going to kind of give a bit of explanation. And some of these words are pretty basic, but some of them you may not know. And in future videos, I may do a little less of that, but we'll just kind of start out this way. So jibun, right, of course, means myself. Pretty straightforward. Ima is now. Pretty basic vocabulary word. All right, nerokomu. It's nekomu. Yeah, nekomu. Is to sleep. Now there's a nuance to it which we can look at later, but for our purposes, it's pretty much sleeping. And then we have waki, which is like to the side of, roughly. And I may come back to these to double check some translation. I just want to put the basic meaning in so we can kind of fit it together in our head. This is furui, obviously old. Ike, right. This is pond. And then obviously frog, which I already have up there, but we'll just put frog down. Right. And the last word, well, taksan is obviously many. There's a bunch of ways to translate that. And then we have iru, which, as we mentioned, was the verb of existence for basically living, breathing things, right? Okay. So I think we got most of the words down. I guess I forgot soko, which is there. And there may be one or two others, but that's most of it. So now let's look at the grammar. We'll kind of look at, the first part here. And fortunately, a lot of these older works have pretty liberal use of commas, which actually help to understand the grammar and how pieces fit together. So first looking at this first phrase here, this jibun no ima nerokondeiru waki ni. And I just realized I'm mispronouncing it. It's not nerokondeiru, it's nekondeiru. So, and if you're ever not sure, you can say nerukoma, that's not right. Okay, nekomu. And if you're also, another thing you could do is ne here, and you're not sure how it conjugates, right? So you can just, if you want to just do this, and nekomu. So the question is, why isn't that showing up? All right, it's showing up now. So we just saw something interesting, right? Which is we cut and paste a verb into the dictionary, and it didn't show up, right? The question is why. So the reason here is, as you notice, there's different ways to write a word. Right? You can write it, and I'll just show you here. This is an important thing to know if you don't already. Nekomu is the hiragana way, right? And then there's nekomu, which is the same word but written in full kanji. The first two characters are kanji. But what we saw is nekomu. Okay? So this is the way that it's used. Of course, it's conjugated into the te form, which is nekonde. And that's not going to show up in the dictionary because at least typically dictionary will have forms like this. And there's other cases that we can talk about in future texts. But so this is nekomu, which is conjugated as nekoronde, all right, which is the correct reading. So ima nekonde iru waki ni. So again, waki is sort of like the side or next to, right? And if you're not sure, of course, you can just double check. Use either Japanese or here. And notice there's two different readings. Ironically, neither of these are the ones that are in the text in terms of the furigana. And again, in older Japanese, you will get different readings, and the author, of course, furigane is free, right? The author can actually put totally different words that are similar, and in this case, it's kind of similar, but it can be a much different word. So here we have gawa, which is side in the dictionary, and soba, which is also similar. It's not exactly the same meaning, has a little more, I guess, abstract meaning in terms of the position, but it's similar, right? And then here we have waki. So let's see what waki says, just to see the nuance difference so we don't get this wrong. So again, we have beside. Now waki here is physically one side, and I know waki no shita is an expression which is kind of like under your armpit. So you can see here there's obviously nuance differences, but we can pretty much, for our purposes now at least, and again, if we were publishing this, we would want to go back and probably double check some things. We could look at some other texts and see how it's used, but this is relatively straightforward. I'm not going to focus too much on this word. So it's basically beside, right? So we can just think of it as beside. And then this is ni, which here is a particle talking about a location. A pretty straightforward use, right? So the way I'm going to translate this, and this isn't necessarily, if I was doing it myself, I might just, in my head, go through it and make a temporary translation, or a first draft at a translation. But just for now, for instructive purposes, I'm just going to take this and make a little more space here. We'll go phrase by phrase, and we'll get something else at the end. We'll kind of put this stuff together. So this phrase here, and let's just try to translate this, right? And again, when you're translating, it doesn't have to be perfect. Even if you're new to translation, maybe it's your first time, that's okay. You just try it. You don't necessarily have to publish anything or even put it online. You just want to, practice the process. So again, jibun, this basically means myself. It probably could have been a boku or a watashi, and there's some nuance there, but we'll just kind of keep it simple and just translate it as I, okay? So a very simple translation of this is beside where I am sleeping. Now notice I'm using the same tense here. This is nekondeiru, which is basically the present, basically the teiru form, which is like you're doing something, like tabeteru, I'm eating type thing. So I'm going to keep this here, where I am sleeping, keep it in the present tense. We could maybe change that later after reading further along, or when we come back and edit this. But we'll keep it for now. Beside where I'm sleeping. Okay, so that's actually going to be capturing this first phrase. Okay, so furui ike ga atte. So, and again, to me, an ike is a pond, but maybe I want to double check. Is there a nuance? Pond, pool. And notice here it says chisana pool. So depending on the context, I could kind of guess. And also, in case you're not used to using dictionaries like this, you can see there's some other helpful text. This is a jinko no mono ga oi, which is man-made. Frequently there's a man or human-made object for the pond, the connotation of a pond. And here it's shizen no mono, tokuni shizen no mono, which is particularly, in particular, naturally made things. But anyway, we're kind of getting a little off topic. A pond is pretty much a good translation. I just want to double check. So let's just translate this. There is a old pond. Right? Pretty straightforward. So, and I'll make a little more room so I can try to squeeze it in one page here. Okay. So we got this last phrase, and again, it's pretty straightforward. Soko ni kaeru ga takusan iru. Okay, again, the grammar is fairly straightforward. Now, the only thing that's a little odd here is we're seeing soko ni, right, which is basically the location of something, right? So grammatically, you may wonder, what is the relation between this ni in this location and this ni in this location? So basically, the way to understand this is, while there is a comma here, this atte is basically connected to this ni, right? And this ni here is connected to this iru, right? So we'll translate that. But this reminds me, I just remembered one additional thing I forgot to explain in the beginning. So this here actually says atsute, right? Which you may have noticed when I was going through it. And the catch with this, and sometimes it's a little hard to tell. So let me just show you in the font I'm doing here what it would actually look like. All right, this is atte, right, with the little pause in the middle, and this is atsute. right? In some fonts, it's a little tricky to tell, so maybe you didn't even notice. But the reason I'm reading this with the pause is, again, this is another characteristic of older traditional Japanese, which is that sometimes the small tsu will be represented as a big one, okay? Which is fine. It can be a little disorienting, but it's pretty easy to catch on to. And I think that's the only instance in this passage. Yeah, it looks like it is. So anyway, just to finish with that sidebar, now we're going to go back to translating this. And now that we know that this ni is applying to this verb, which is actually, aru, the verb of existence. And here I actually have aru, and I can add that, I guess, verb of existence for non-living things, right? And what is existing? Well, the pond, right? Of course, it's non-living in some sense. So what I'm going to do is, let's see, I'll just kind of scroll down, and let's go ahead and translate this, right? So there. Now, this is where we get into tenses again. So my instinct here was to use were, was. I want to use, thinking of some using in the past tense, but let's just keep it in the present tense for consistency, and then we can come back and decide at the end what we want to stay with. So again, this is iru, it's not ita. All right, so just to keep it as literal as possible, right? There, let's see, are many frogs, right? And again, there. So, and just again, a point about Japanese, depending on your level, you may or may not know that Japanese typically doesn't have plural. There is some exceptions, but here the word kaeru, frog, can basically represent one frog or more than one frog, right? It's not really defined. So you can typically tell from context. Here, the word takusan, which means many, clearly indicates there's more than one frog. So hence I use frogs. Okay, so let's kind of put it together, and I'll just cut and paste this and get closer to a final result. So what I'm going to do now is I'm not going to use commas. Now I could, but let's see how it looks like without commas, right? So fortunately, this is a pretty straightforward sentence, and there's not a lot of complex flow. So let's just see, maybe we can keep it like this without the commas, right? Keep in mind, we don't have to necessarily maintain the commas. Sometimes I've advocated for, trying to maintain the commas for the pacing, and that isn't definitely about a good option. But let's just look at it here. Keep things simple, okay? So then another thing, if you're a writer or you've done any editing, you probably know that reading things out loud is extremely helpful for understanding flow, in terms of the pauses and also in terms of catching mistakes, right? And even grammar mistakes, spelling mistakes. It's just, you kind of have a different mind, right? When you're just reading in your head. So let's go ahead and do that, right? Beside where I am sleeping, there is an old pond. There are many frogs there. Okay? So clearly, right, and even before I read this out loud, I kind of knew that there was something weird going on here, right? And notice this is a thing in terms of the Japanese tenses, right? So we have written as atsute, but atte, which is the te form of aru, the verb of existence for non-living things, right? So the te form, there's different ways to interpret it, but one of the most common is do one action and another, right? And just to kind of have a little sidebar here, I can say suwatte taberu, right? I sit down and eat, right? Now they could be separate, or kind of at the same time. There's different, and it could even be sort of an adverbial usage. I think I wrote an article on that a few months ago. But the quick way to understand it is just and, right? And you notice I didn't use and at all. So of course it's probably not going to sound that. So let's add this and let's read through it again, a little quicker this time. Beside where I'm sleeping, there is an old pond, and there are many frogs there. Okay, now I noticed I had a mistake. I added there twice. Okay, there are many frogs. Okay, so let's take it off at the end. And just another thing, if you're a writer already, you probably have a good grasp of some of the tweaks you can do to passages, but a lot of times I've heard, or at least from one or two sources, that it's good to have the important things at the very beginning or the end of the sentence. So a word like there is, it's not that strong, I guess. It isn't that important, right? So I could have maybe put there earlier in the sentence, but I'm going to just actually, I am putting it earlier in the sentence. What I meant to say is I could have put it at the end, but I decided to remove it because I think frogs is more important. So this is just a little thing you can kind of think of when you're writing or translating, see if it helps. It's not a hard and fast rule. Anyway, I could have said something like, and frogs, and many frogs are there. That would have been the other way to phrase it, where there is at the end. So I chose to put there in the middle, okay? So it's just a minor wording thing, but I think it'll sound a little bit better. All right, so one more read through. Beside where I'm sleeping, there is an old pond, and there are many frogs. So one good thing about this sentence is the parallel structure, right? We have there is an old frog, or sorry, there is an old pond, and there are many frogs, right? Which is kind of nice parallel structure. We could even do this here. It almost looks like a poem, right? You can see it kind of matches up, right? Which is kind of cool. So I think at this point I'm probably going to stop. I won't go too much further. I was originally planning on doing a second paragraph, but we ran into a few things here, which is good. We had some good things to talk about. And in terms of this passage, I mean, I think it's good enough to kind of move on. If I was translating, I would kind of leave it at this point, and then move on to the next paragraph. And then when I came back to this later, I might tweak it again, right? So I mean, what just in a general sense, I mean, what could we do to tweak it? Beside where I'm sleeping, there is an old pond, and there are many frogs. No, I think it's okay. I think it definitely has potential as a sentence that maybe could be published or something that I could be happy with. But again, when you come back to a passage like this a day later or even an hour later, sometimes you kind of notice that there's phrasing that's much different, right? I could do it this way, I could do it that way, and that might actually be influenced by the stuff that you translate later, or even the book you happen to read, in between your sessions of translating or editing. You can get new ideas, so that's why I always recommend make sure you read a lot, of course, in both languages, in this case, Japanese and English. You know what? As I was editing this video, I actually realized my mistake. So, let's talk about my mistake. So, here we're using the word there, all right? And now the word there in English is a little confusing because it can kind of have two different meanings, right? It can talk about a location, like soko, right? But it could also be kind of have a different purpose. Now, grammatically, I'm not sure what that's called, but you could just say there are 3 people in the room, right? In that case, like just look at, there are 3 people in the room. Okay, so in this case, the word there doesn't really mean soko. It doesn't mean there like necessarily, in terms of that literal sense, because in the room is actually the location, right? That's being referred to in this case. So it's a little confusing. And the reason this matters is, and when I went back and looked at this, I noticed that, originally I had 2 theirs, right? And this was actually more literally close, because there are many frogs there. And then I deleted this one, giving me, and there are many frogs. So when I reread this, during, when I was just editing, kind of rewatching the video, I realized that it's definitely awkward, right? Because I have, where I'm sleeping, there is an old pond. This sounds fine, but then I said there are many frogs, right? So originally I was thinking, yeah, the parallel structure is nice, but the there's here, first of all, I'm already saying there, right? Which is a little strange because this there and this there, I mean, I intended them as different things, right? This there I intended as to mean soko, whereas this one is more of just kind of a connecting word, right? And even worse, these 2 theirs, they have different meanings, right? In terms of like what the place they're referring to, right? Here the there is just kind of, like I said, it's a more of a connecting word. Here it's referring to the old pond, right? So after thinking about this a little bit, just for, I guess, I don't know, a minute or two, I realized that there's a good way to clean this up, at least in terms of clarifying those issues, right? So we can replace and with where, right? Which connects things. So let's read this again. Beside where I'm sleeping, there's an old pond where there are many frogs. So to me, this sounds much better. Now, sometimes if you have the same word twice in a sentence, like the there and the there, you can call that an echo, or that can be a good thing or a bad thing. And now we also have where and where. So again, I don't think this is necessarily a final iteration. But I mean, if I were just reading this naturally, beside where I'm sleeping, there's an old pond where there are many frogs. I think it's not that bad. It's definitely better than the version with and in it. Like if you were to compare, you can read them, and you'll probably see if you read this, you kind of get stuck on it. Now that I'm thinking in terms of this, and so I definitely like this one better. But the where echo here, I'm not a little happy with. So or I should say I'm not too happy with. So I might want to go back and refactor this. But again, this is the first episode, and I think this is good enough. Anyway, so I think that mostly completes our first one. So just to kind of finish things off, I just want to briefly mention a new book that I released. It's a novella, which I translated from Japanese to English by the author Yumeno Kyusaku. The name of it's The Spirit Drum. You can find it on Amazon, and I'll put some links down in the text description. So if you like this, of course, please consider supporting me by buying this. And also, as I mentioned, the main thing I do is the Self-Taught Japanese, which is sort of a blog that I have over, I guess, 600 at least articles on Japanese culture, media. I have reviews, a lot of grammar posts. I have some free translations, which you can see there's a link here, and a bunch of other things. So anyway, I think that ends our session. Thanks for watching to the end.